Hey guys, and now it's time for the reading. It's been very, very long, hasn't it? Strange for such short texts. We seem to be spending a lot of time analysing them, don't we? But that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to go at these things with as much ferocity as we possibly can muster. Alright, so what are we going to achieve in this video? Well, this time, instead of outlining, we're going to trace. Whoop, that's the wrong one. Don't want to do that. We're going to do this one here. We're going to trace how Aristotle arrived at the concept of the golden mean, because we've already looked at that through the summary. What we need to do now is we need to explore how he's going to do that through the reading. So this means we need to draw on knowledge gained from our summary that we covered in the last video. Then we need to again explore how virtues are states of characters, not passions or capacities, as defined in the summary before. And then we're going to see how we arrive at this pretty complex but main point, which is that Aristotle concluded that an intermediate point in a scale about degrees of behavior, which is called the golden mean, is where we identify virtue or virtuous behavior. And we're going to see how this is developed, not necessarily put together through summaries of arguments. Now, it's pretty easy. I think if we're talking about a golden mean, we're obviously talking about equalities or equal weights on both sides or equal numbers on both sides. So draw me some scales that are balanced and see if that fits with the metaphor of the seesaw. Obviously, the seesaw is perfectly aligned perfectly at the middle of the fulcrum point, whatever we want to call it, to allow it to top over it, for allow it to go over on both sides. But obviously a scale can also be used to draw this concept of the golden mean. If we have both sides equally weighted, perhaps we have what you would expect. We've discovered the virtuous mean or the golden mean. So let's score these and draw the APK. Okay, so let's start off at the beginning, shall we? The genus, which means the type of moral virtue, is a state of character. It's not a passion nor a capacity. We know that from the summary. Next, we must consider what virtue is. Since things are found in the soul are of three kinds: passions, capacities, states of character. Virtue must be one of these. By passions, I mean appetite, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, friendly feeling, hatred, longing, emulation, pity, and in general the feelings that are accompanied by pleasure or pain. By capacity, the things in virtue of which we are said to be capable of feeling these. So by capacities, the things in virtue of which we are said to be capable of feeling these. For example, of becoming angry, or of being pinned, or being pained, or feeling pity. So guys, he's just basically saying that capacity is what you think. It's the capacity to become angry. It's the capacity to be pained, or the capacity to feel pity. So it's capacity in what we normally expect, and I would have got confused if I said the things in virtue of which we are said to be capable of feeling. That would have confused me. What's this things of virtue reference? I guess what we're capable of feeling, that talks about capacity, but I don't really understand this reference to things in virtue. All right. By states of character, we're talking about the things in virtue. So basically, he's saying capacities are in virtue. Obviously, passions are not. But states of character are also something that is in virtue. By states of character, the things in virtue which we stand well or badly with reference to the passions. E.g., with reference to anger, we stand badly if we feel it violently or too weakly, and well if we feel it in an intermediate way. So what he's basically saying is virtue can be defined as a way with which we stand to our passions and react and control our passions. And this relates very much to things that he said previously, where he says the point is teaching someone how to react to pleasure and pain. And if you notice, he said here pleasure and pain are a major source of our passions. So I think we need to take a note, because that wasn't brought up in the summary. Now neither the virtues nor the vices are passions, because we are not called good or bad on the ground of our passions, but are so called on the ground of our virtues and our vices. So we are blamed and told we are good or bad based on the virtues and based on our vices. Can you take a note? Sure, that was brought up in the summary, but he says it pretty plainly there too. And because we are neither praised nor blamed for our passions, for the man who feels fear or anger is not praised, nor is the man who simply feels anger blamed, but the man who feels it in a certain way. But for our virtues and vices, we are praised or blamed. So we are praised or blamed for our virtues and vices, which is what we wrote up here. Again, we feel anger and fear without choice, but the virtues are modes of choice or involve choice. So virtues give us choice. We have choice with respect, obviously, to how we stand to our emotions or our passions, which is what he set up here. So again, we feel anger and fear without choice. We don't have choice in feeling these things, but we do have choice with the way that we stand to them, which could be our virtue. Further, in respect of our passions, we are said to be moved, but in respect of the virtues and the vices, we are said not to be moved, but to be disposed in a particular way. So that means that, funny, we don't really talk about being moved without choice when we're talking about virtues, but we do have dispositions or innate tendencies to behave in a particular way based on our vices or virtues, which are the inner states that we've cultivated. For these reasons, also they are not capacities, for we are neither called good nor bad, nor praised nor blamed, for the simple capacity of feeling the passions. Again, we have the capacities by nature, but we are not made good or bad by nature. We have spoken of this before. We are made good or bad through the choices, and that basically means the application of reason also to pursuing virtuous excellence, moral excellence, I should say. So, obviously, capacities to feel the passions are not something we're blamed for, but we are blamed for how we stand with respect to them, which is something you said previously. And that's not something that happens by nature. We have to cultivate, or we have to acquire that through habits. Okay. If then virtues are neither passions or capacity, all that remains is that they should be states of character. Thus, we have stated what virtue is in respect of its genus. Take some notes. All right, chapter 6 is going to be a long one, but you already expected that because somehow it's got to elaborate on the generalization of a golden mean and then the two vices of both of defect and excess, but he's got to do it in a way that is abstract and almost like he's deducing his way to it. So let's have a look. The differentia of moral virtue. It is a disposition to choose the intermediate point. It's our capacity to, not our capacity, but our cultivated tendency to choose the intermediate between two kinds of vices. We know that. Let's keep reading. We must, however, not only describe virtue as a state of character, but also say that it is a state of, also say what sort of state it is. We may remark when that every virtue or excellence, remember virtue is defined as excellence, both brings into good condition the thing of which is the excellence and makes the work of that thing to be done well. All right, so we said that if you cultivate, this is what we said in the summary, if you cultivate a virtuous behavior, you become virtuous, but also the virtue brings into being more virtue. So if you're already cultivated the quality of being temperate, it's easier to be temperate. So you bring into being the action of temperate behavior and you make the person more temperate. So it's like a two-way process. You bring into being the virtue, but the virtue also brings you into being, okay, as a virtuous man. And that's what it said here. Then at every virtual excellence, both brings into good condition the thing of which is the excellence. So it makes the thing into the condition of excellent, but it also makes work the thing that is done well. So he's really abstract language here, but when you engage in virtual excellence, you bring the thing into a good condition. You say, this is a good flute player, this is a good man, right? But it also makes a behavior that and does that behavior well. Take a note. For example, the excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its work good. So the eye will be good if it is excellent, but also the work that it does is excellent. For it is by the excellence of the eye that we see well. Similarly, the excellence of the horse makes a horse both good in itself and good at running and at carrying its rider and at awaiting the attack of the enemy. Therefore, if this is true in every case, the virtue of man also will be the state of character which makes a man good, right? That makes sense. The state of character which allows a man to make himself good, right? And which makes him do his work well. That makes sense. Because just saying you are a good horse allows you to perform all the qualities of a good horse and be a good horse, being a virtuous man allows you to perform all the qualities that are virtuous, and it also allows you to be virtuous. Okay, take a note. How is this to happen? We have stated already, but it will be made plain so by the following consideration of the specific nature of virtue. In everything that is continuous and divisible, it is possible to take more or less or an equal amount, and that either in terms of the thing itself or relative to us. All right, so you can take more, less, or an equal amount of anything that is divisible in relative to the thing in itself. So I can take more chocolate, less chocolate, or I can take an equal amount when I divide it, or I can take it more than somebody else. All right, and equal is the intermediate point. This is what we were talking about before, between excess and defect. By the intermediate in the object, I mean that which is equidistant from both extremes. We talked about this in the summary, right? We're talking about the equal point in between, like for instance, the vices of cowardice and rashness. The equidistant point is going to be bravery, okay? Which is one and the same for all. By the intermediate relativity to us, that which is neither too much nor too little. And this is not one nor the same for all. So what he's saying is, okay, it might still vary in circumstances, but basically too much or too little, good way to think about vices of defect and vices of excess. For instance, if 10 is many and 2 is few, 6 is the intermediate. You take in terms of the object, for it exceeds and is exceeded by an equal amount. This is intermediate according to arithmetical proportion. In other words, what he's saying is obviously if you look at like 2 being too few and 6 being too much, then the midpoint, sorry, 2 being too few and 10 being too much, then the midpoint would be 6, because you can see how it works when you minus 4 from 6. So it's pretty self-explanatory, and he's saying if you use arithmetic, then you can arrive at that conclusion, okay? But the intermediate relatively to us is not to be taken. So if 10 pounds is too much for a particular person to eat and 2 too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds, for this is also perhaps too much for the person to take it, or too little. Too little for Milo, too much for the beginner in an athletic exercise. And this is why he was talking about relative to us up here. So I made a brief reference to it where he said that nor the same for all. So he's talking about how you define the vice of deficiency and the vice of effect. And obviously they would be different depending on your own circumstances. And if we make strength a good example of that, we can see that Milo obviously has a different, he has different too muches or too littles, because obviously he's a wrestler, whereas the beginner would have something completely different. So the circumstances determine what is too much or too little. But do they determine the equidistant point? Maybe. That could be considered as well, based on who the person is. So the same is true of running and wrestling. Thus, a master of any art avoids excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this. And this is what, and the capacity and tendency to choose this, the cultivated behavior to choose this intermediate point, is what a state of virtue, a state of character is, or a virtue is. All right, take a note. The intermediate, not the object, but relative to us. So in other words, he's saying intermediate, not in the external thing, but in relative to what we need and our level of expertise, etc. That wasn't in the summary, and that probably should be written down and recorded somewhere. Take a note. If it is thus then that every art does its work well by looking to the intermediate and judging its works by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defects destroy the goodness of the work of art, while the mean preserves it, and good artists, as we say, look to this in their work. So he's using art as an allegory for, for the golden mean, or for the midpoint, the intermediate point. You might want to take a note. And if further virtue is more exact and better than any art, as nature also is, then virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate, I mean moral virtue. For it is this that is concerned with passions and actions, and these there is excess, and in these there is excess and defect and the intermediate point. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger, and pity and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best, and is characteristic of virtue. So what he's basically saying is you can imagine the intermediate points mentioned in these two pairs here. All right, all the vices, pairs of vices. Similarly, with regard to actions, there is also excess and defect and the intermediate. Now, with virtue, is concerned with the passions and actions in which excess is a form of failure, and also defect, with while the intermediate is praised and is a form of success. So what he's saying is that when talking about virtue, excessive behavior in one direction or defective behavior in one direction will be considered a failure. But if you achieve the intermediate point, that will be considered a success. Take a note. And you'll be praised. So, and being praised and being successful are both characteristics of virtue. So you'll be praised if you can achieve that intermediate point. Therefore, virtue is a kind of mean, since, as we have seen, it aims at what is intermediate. It's a golden mean. Again, it is possible to fail in many ways, for evil belongs to the class of the unlimited, as Pythagoras conjectured, and good to that of the limited. Well, to succeed is possible only in one way, and that makes sense. If you don't behave in a way that tries to approximate the intermediate point of the golden mean, obviously you're going to fail through defect or excess. It's just going to make sense. But if you get that one mid-sweet point, and there's only one place to get it, then you've done well. Makes sense. For which reason also one is easy and the other is difficult, to miss the mark easy, but to hit it difficult. For these reasons also then, excess and defect are characteristic of vice, and the mean of virtue. For men are good in one way, but bad in many. And that makes so sense when you think about it in terms of the way the virtue ethic is laid out in Aristotle's writing. Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice. In other words, you have to choose to achieve the intermediate point. Lying in a mean, the intermediate point, i.e. the mean relative to us, or relative to what you and I need as individuals. This being determined by reason, so you use the intellect to understand what that intermediate point is relative to you, and you use it to choose. And that reason by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. So any man who can use practical wisdom would achieve this. Take some notes. Now, it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because vices respectively fall short or exceed what is right in both passions and actions. So in your feelings or in your activities, vices of excess or vices of defect both achieve too little or overachieve, or they basically behave in excess. Makes sense. While virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate, hence, in respect of what it is, i.e. the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. Best and right and extreme. I don't know why it says best. With regard to what is best and right and extreme. I have no idea what you're referring to there, mate. But not every action or every passion admits of a mean, so you can engage in actions that don't have intermediate points. For some have names already which imply badness, for example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and in the case of the actions, adultery, theft, and murder. For all these and such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad, and not the excess or deficiencies of them. It is not possible then ever to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. So some passions and some actions are always going to be wrong, and that's contained within their name. It is not possible, then, ever to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. Nor does goodness or badness with regard to such things depend on committing adultery with the right woman at the right time and the right way, but simply to do any of them is to go wrong. So what he's basically saying is, if you do the wrong thing, it doesn't make it right by doing it in the right way with the right person and everything, like you mentioned over here that you should do with virtue. Right way to do anything is wrong. It would be equally absurd then to expect in unjust, cowardly, and self-indulgent action there should be a mean and an excess and a deficiency, for at that rate there would be a mean of excess and deficiency, an excess of excess, and a deficiency of deficiency. But as there is no excess and deficiency of temperance and courage, because there is an intermediate, is a sense an extreme. So to the actions we have mentioned there is no mean or excess and deficiency. But however, they are done wrong. For in general, there is neither a mean of excess or deficiency, nor excess and deficiency of a mean. So what he's basically saying is some behaviors are just the vices and you can't have a mean behavior of them, but some behaviors you could imagine could be on a sphere or like on a scale where they could have an intermediate point and you could have vices of excess and deficiency. That's all he's saying. All right, so have we achieved our 3 success criteria? Let's have a look-see. We don't need that. We need this. Did we draw on our prior knowledge? I think everything we talked about was brought up in our prior knowledge. I think by reading, it made much more sense than the summary this time, unlike other readings. I see how states of character, according to his logic, are states of virtue in 2 ways. We are basically, we have choice. We are praised and blamed for them, but not only that too, they're states of character that allow us to achieve goodness and to be good. So, you know, once you cultivate your virtue or your state of character by doing good things, those virtues then allow you to be good and to basically behave good. All right. I do understand now the idea of the intermediate point and how we can think of some behaviors as having scales. Some behaviors won't be on scales. We also know that some behaviors will just be bad because they are vices of excess or vices of defect. But some do have scales and they have intermediate points. And we can name those behaviors like bravery. And bravery is the intermediate point, which is destroyed by courage. Which is destroyed by rashness or destroyed by cowardice. 2 other actions. And we know why it's called the golden mean, and it's where we do identify what is virtuous behavior, and we apply it, and we get there through reason alone. And if we perform anything virtuous, we know that we're going to be judged well. Cheers.